All right. Hope everyone can hear me. Hello, everyone. I'm Bashir, the Dissemination Manager for PRG. Thank you, and the four speakers taking for time out and being here today. I warmly welcome all of you to this webinar titled "Impunity is the Norm: 1 year into the attacks against Muslims in the aftermath of Easter Sunday bombing in Sri Lanka." PRG stands for People's Rights Group, a rights-based advocacy and lobbying group based in UK. Formed in 2019 with the purpose of taking up issues relating to and assisting the victim of human rights violations in Sri Lanka. Since then, we have been able to highlight continuing human rights violations and brought them to the attention of human rights watchdogs. I wish to initially take you through some housekeeping rules. While our speakers are sharing their thoughts, I will put your microphones on mute. I'm afraid they will not be able to allow the raise hand options while they speak. I therefore encourage you to forward your question through the chat option. And I would love to hear from you, so I will unmute you to raise the question during Q&A. At the end, we will try to answer all the questions posed. Depending on the time, if your questions were not answered or you have any further questions, you could even email your questions later to our attention, and also a recorded version of this webinar will also be made available. Let me give a perspective of this webinar today. This webinar will focus on continuing anti-Muslim hate campaign in Sri Lanka, with special attention on the attacks against Muslims in the aftermath of Easter Sunday attacks in 2019 and the attendant impunity crisis in Sri Lanka. Easter Sunday terror attacks by a French radical Muslim group was indeed a terrible disaster which killed over 250 innocent people and injured many more, was a deplorable and needs to be severely condemned. However, renewed anti-Muslim hate came to the forefront of Sri Lankan politics after these attacks, which became a game changer for Muslims in Sri Lanka. This is, however, not new. Since independence in 1948, Sri Lanka has been a tinderbox of sectarian and ethnic tensions, with a war that took a heavy toll on lives and human rights of the Tamil community. Since the end of the war in 2009, institutionalized racism has led to hate campaigns and many more violent anti-Muslim attacks, even while other minorities have not been spared. With the government and law enforcement authorities turning a blind eye and even pardoning convicted perpetrators, impunity and lack of accountability have become a norm. Since the last presidential election, the environment has turned more hostile. On the heels of post-Easter Sunday anti-Muslim bigotry came the state-sanctioned corona racism, which has been targeting the Muslims, including a forced cremation policy in violation of their religious rights. In this backdrop of apathy of the government machinery and the impunity crisis in Sri Lanka, Muslims of Sri Lanka are facing anguish and agony with their religious and cultural rights are being violated. Against this backdrop, we are pleased to launch the report on post-Easter Sunday attacks on the Muslim community, authored by SMA Nias and edited and published by PRG. We are also happy to have four eminent speakers join us today. Let me introduce them. First, Alan Keenan. Alan is a senior consultant on Crisis Group based in London. He coordinates and contributes to the organization research, publication, and advocacy on Sri Lanka. Alan has lived and worked in Sri Lanka for extended periods since first visiting in February 2000. Alan has PhD in political theory and has taught at various US colleges and universities before joining Crisis Group in 2006. Second, Dr. Feroz Mubarak. Dr. Feroz is a senior medical professional working as a GP principal in the largest GP partnership in London. He is the practice strategy lead for COVID-19 in North London. He is the Assistant Director General for Global Initiative for Peace and Coexistence, which works globally to bring divided communities together and makes way for minorities to live peacefully in countries plagued by political and socio-economic diversity. Third, Anika Zomi. Anika has Masters in Social Justice and Equity Studies and the lead coordinator for Canadian for Sri Lankan minorities. Lastly, our author, SMA Nias. Nias is the Director of International Institute for Research, Information and Exchange based in Sri Lanka, and also author of Attacks Against Muslims in the Aftermath of Easter Sunday Bombing in Sri Lanka. He will be moderating the question and answer session later on. Once again, I welcome all the panelists and participants, and we'll move to the first item, which is a short recap video of the footages from last year attacks on Sri Lankan Muslims in Kurunegala and Negombo districts.
ජයතිලකයි ඔන්න වැඩ පෙට්‍රෝල් අදින බයික් එක ඔය ආයි ගින දාන්න මල් ඔය වැඩ තමයි මම සුපිරිය ඔව් මට අපි යනවා අනුවා ආරු මේ පැත්තෙන්
අක්කේ නිමන්න බෑ මේක වැඩක් නෑ මං අර අරුණේ සල්ලි ගන්න එකට ගියා
Welcome back. Now I get straight over to Anika to present the report on attacks against Muslims in the aftermath of Easter Sunday bombing in Sri Lanka. Author of this report is SMA Nias, but it was edited by Sister Anika. So Anika, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning from Canada, everybody. My name is Anika Zalmi. As Mr. Bazir shared, I hold a Master of Arts in Social Justice and Equity Studies from Brock University here in Canada. And my focus there was really around equity, diversity, and inclusion. My specific focus was in social business, but I've carried a lot of that over into my career now. So where I'm focusing a lot on anti-oppression, working on addressing systemic discrimination and racism within policies and institutions. So as Mr. Bazir shared, I have the pleasure of presenting some of the work that I was able to contribute to this report that was authored by Mr. Nias and was edited by People's Rights Group. I was looped in through this because I've done some work and have been affiliated with organizations alongside People's Rights Group in the past. And what we've been working on over the past year is really bringing awareness to systemic discrimination within Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has had a troubled history with minorities, and this is not something that is new or only relevant to Muslims in Sri Lanka. This is something that the Tamils more recently have gone through and have done a really good job internationally of activating their diaspora and bringing awareness within multiple international spaces. We see a lot of activism here in Canada. There's been discrimination even prior to that, including of Indigenous communities in Sri Lanka. So this discrimination is not something that's necessarily new, but the way that it's taking advantage of political and religious lines targeting Muslims is new. And it's been really sobering to see how these how something like an attack that was instituted by a fringe extremist group has been used to ostracize and penalize the entire community, and how that's used as justification to continue the systemic discrimination from the top down within the country. So this report is really looking at collecting and highlighting and consolidating primary data related to victims and survivors of violence, property attacks, and general intimidation. So Mr. Nias was able to go and speak directly to people who have been affected by attacks following the Easter Sunday bombing. The timing of these attacks, as we saw in the video, there has been violence towards and against the Muslim community in Sri Lanka even prior to the Easter Sunday bombing in 2019. But the use of the bombing to really push the agenda that Muslims are not part and parcel of Sri Lanka's land, that they are extremists, that they don't belong, that they are responsible for violence, not just the Easter Sunday bombing in particular, but that they are deserving of other forms of violence, significantly escalated the nature of attacks that Muslims in Sri Lanka were facing. And so Mr. Nias went through and contacted individuals who have experienced property damage, who have been a victim of physical violence, of intimidation, of damage to their businesses. And for the first time, probably, has consolidated this into a report that highlights just the amount of damage, the monetary value of damage, the stories of individuals who have experienced this violence, and looking at, what are concrete ways forward, what are the numbers to this story, and who are the people behind these instances. And it was very, very, very humbling to hear just the overt discrimination, how while the government has been working to more diplomatically conceal this vilification of the Muslim community, it's filtered over into other religious and racial or ethnic communities within Sri Lanka being very overt in their ostracization of Muslims. People losing their jobs for their identity, people seeing religious institutions being attacked and burned. So it's been saddening to see how these repercussions have continued and will continue. I think the most poignant example right now is the way that the Sri Lankan government is using the coronavirus pandemic as a tool for this continued ostracization and vilification, claiming that Muslims somehow are the only carriers of the disease, and they are the ones who brought coronavirus to Sri Lanka, and then using that as a tool to deny human rights, including the right to practice religious rulings around burial, and forcing Sri Lankan Muslims to cremate their dead under the guise that coronavirus can be contained through creation, which is a statement that is directly contrary to the information shared by leading health experts as well as the World Health Organization, all of whom state that there is no preference for burning, for cremation versus burial when it comes to the containment of coronavirus and the potential runoff of the contamination there. So it's been saddening, interesting to see how Mr. Nias has really taken advantage of collecting data at a crucial point at this kind of cusp of years-long hatred and vilification, moving into, which has been kind of under the guise of whatever excuse that has been used thus far, and how we're at this point where we're seeing the spillover into overt religious discrimination and overt denial of human rights, and how we see this overflowing into coronavirus. And we're understanding that if we don't address the situation now, if we don't come up with a multi-pronged strategy that involves not only organizations on the ground, but also communities in diaspora, the diaspora abroad, we will only continue to fall off, fall into the deep end and see this only escalate even further to, complete genocide. So I'm really pleased to be able to be here with all of you to really discuss, what has happened within the last year, and then see where we can go from this now with the information we have. So thank you so much. Mr. Bazir, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anika. That's a great presentation of the report to get started. You can download the report on our website, which is prgsrilanka.org. The link is on the front page anyway. So now I'll turn it over to our guest speaker, Alan Keenan, to give an overview of the situation of human rights and racism in Sri Lanka. Alan, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bashir. Thanks, Anika. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be here. Well, here, wherever here is. Good to see you all in this virtual space. I just thought I would quickly run through, some of it's, we saw little bits of it already in the video, and some of it's mentioned in the report, but I thought I would just kind of go through what I think are the different stages of anti-Muslim campaigning and the different forms it's taken over the years to sort of put the events that the report details into a larger context, and to highlight some of the shifts, particularly the shifts in the role of the state vis-a-vis the Muslim community and vis-a-vis discrimination and aggression against them. So I'm just going to go through in the different stages. So before the war and during the war, the civil war between the Sri Lankan state and the Tamil Tigers, and before that other militant Tamil groups, there were occasional altercations, moments of violence between Muslims and other groups. So of course, most famously, the 1915 anti-Muslim riots. But we also saw incidents in which Muslim businesses and houses and mosques were violently attacked in Puttalam in 1976, in Gaul in 1982, in Mabanella in 2001. There's a very valuable study of these incidents done by Vijay Nagaraj and Farah Hanifa, published by the International Center for Ethnic Studies in Colombo, if anyone wants to get a sense of the longer history. And I think even before the rise of the post-war campaign against Muslims, there has for a long time been resentment among other communities, principally among Sinhalese, at the role that Muslim politicians have played as quote-unquote kingmakers, the way they've used the parliamentary system to always make sure that they are in government, and that their communities therefore get some of the perks that having ministers representing you brings. Also at Muslims' economic power. And I think from the time I started going to Sri Lanka in 2000, there was already a discourse about the changing nature of the Muslim community, the growing influence of Middle Eastern practices and more conservative piety movements, and the effects one saw that in dress of both men and women, and in increasing sort of turn to the religious version of a Muslim identity. So that's been around for a while, but we saw a sharp change, I think. So the second major stage comes in the immediate aftermath of the war and the victory of the government over the Sri Lankan, over the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers. So 2011, 12, up until 13, we saw the emergence of new militant groups claiming to defend Buddhism. So the most famous of these is the Bodo Balasena, BBS. There's also Singalavaya, Ravana Balakaya, a few other small ones. Also just independent entrepreneurs. So we saw a few incidents, for instance, in Anuradhapura in 2011, I think is the first known public act of violence against a Muslim religious site. We also saw an incident in Dambulla, which became violent. But these were still sort of minor, modest developments. In 2013, you get to the next stage, 2013, 2014, when BBS became a powerful national force, taking the lead, and with others, with these other groups and with some politicians, creating and enforcing a new discourse of Muslims as a threat to Sri Lanka and to the Buddhist and Sinhala character of the island. So they raised a series of specific and often shifting issues and allegations about the nature of the Muslim threat. So we saw them look at the halal, the issue of halal, the allegations of plans of kind of conspiracies to sterilize Buddhists through items purchased in Muslim shops or in food at restaurants. We saw worries about the growing population of Muslims and allegations this was going to swamp the Sinhala and Buddhist community. And we saw allegations of growing extremism in the community. Now, the BBS was able to dominate the political agenda in these years with regular press conferences, always widely covered in the media, very theatrical, well-done sort of performances by Yanasara, the BBS leader, and others, and large public rallies. There are also vigilante attacks, often based on rumors, attacks on shops, Muslim-owned shops, on mosques, harassment of individual Muslims. And a lot of the force of this came from online hate speech, which became increasingly well organized and effective. Now, the height of this period was, the most important incident in this period was the violence in June 2014 in the towns of Aludgama, Beruvela, and Darga town, where for 2 days there was major violence against Muslim businesses and shops and mosques and houses, with a couple of people killed, I think 2 people killed, a number injured. And supposedly in response to an alleged attack on a Buddhist monk, which in fact the evidence suggests was not much of an attack. And in fact, if anyone was attacked, it was the Muslims in that incident. But in any case, all these activities, I think, had the de facto support of the then government of Mahinda Rajapaksa, with his brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and a very powerful, head of the military and the police. So we saw the police regularly pressure victims, Muslim victims, to drop complaints, to not pursue cases in court. We saw that they didn't investigate or charge the perpetrators for any of these incidents. There's credible evidence that military intelligence was monitoring incidents closely and knew about them before they happened, but nothing was done to stop them. And we saw the government make no attempt to challenge the growing discourse against Muslims. Now, clearly they thought at the time that it was politically useful for them. In fact, at that point, it ended up backfiring and contributing to the defeat of Mahinda Rajapaksa in the January 2015 presidential election, due in large part because of the overwhelming vote against him by Muslims, some of whom had previously supported the Rajapaksas and their SLFP party. So in January 2015, many people thought, they breathed a sigh of relief. They thought, we have a new government coming in headed by President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. They've campaigned on a promise to end violence against Muslims, promised, to crack down and to bring in a new, more peaceful environment. But unfortunately, they didn't really deliver much. Now, BBS and some of the other groups quieted down for a while, but eventually they came back, and by 2016, 17, they were up to a lot of the same activities. New groups emerged, in particular Sinhala, which began in 2015, and then later Mahason Balakaya. And small-scale incidents of violence began to emerge again. Now, while in this period, the state didn't actively help the attackers, and in fact, sometimes some were arrested, there were no prosecutions, no effective prosecutions, and government officials only occasionally, and in the mildest ways, challenged the discourse that framed Muslims as a threat. So there was an opportunity here to really try to shift the discourse and to end impunity, at least to begin to chip away at impunity, at the culture of impunity, which has, as the previous presentations have suggested, is a long-standing problem that Muslims are not the only ones who suffer from, but in fact many Tamils for many generations have suffered from this, as have other dissidents from other communities. So the high point of this period, of course, was March 2018, and the 4 or 5 days of violence centered mostly in the Kandy district, which was the largest ever, I think, still the largest ever wave of violence against Muslims. And this came just as the Rajapaksa's new party, the SLPP, began its march to power following their success in the February local government elections. So we saw some new groups emerge, as I've said, to take up the space partially vacated by BBS. We saw an increased and more effective use of social media in Facebook, but also WhatsApp, used to spread rumors and to organize attack. Now, on a positive side, the violence did generate widespread disapproval, including from most Buddhists and some of the senior Buddhist clergy. But this was due, I think, in part to the damage done to the tourist industry and to the larger Sri Lankan economy from the state of emergency that was declared to contain the violence. So lots of tourists stopped coming, and lots of people suffered economically because of it. So I think a lot of Buddhists and Sinhalese began to think, this is not a good thing. I think many of them had opposed these activities even more, even before this, but this was a real wake-up call, at least a partial wake-up call. So the partial backlash against anti-Muslim violence gave the courts some space to take on Yanasara, the BBS leader. So in 2018, later that year, he was convicted of criminal intimidation and later of contempt of court, and he was actually sent to jail, which was unprecedented. Now, this was a small but notable victory against impunity, though it's worth noting, as many did at the time, that Yanasara was jailed for crimes against the court and against a Sinhala activist, and not for any of the anti-Muslim incidents he encouraged or been a part of. Nonetheless, it was a small victory, and there was some hope that maybe it presaged a shift. However, everything changed again in April 2019, last year, when the horrific Easter bombings carried out by Zaharan and his group of followers and linked to the National Tawhid Jamaat and other groups. And this, of course, there was the terrible devastation to the families of the victims, and the shock and fear it spread throughout all of society. And it confirmed, it seemed to many Sri Lankans, not just Sinhalese, but also Tamils and Christians, to confirm the years of warnings about growing Muslim extremism that the militant Buddhist groups had been promoting. And even though the jihadi attacks were condemned by every Muslim leader in the country and by the vast, vast majority of Muslims, and even though Muslim activists were themselves the ones who had warned the police and the government about the activities of Zaharan for years and called for strong action against him, still, as has been pointed out already, Muslims as a whole found themselves blamed for the violence and came under increasing pressure. So we saw another, as the report documents quite well, we saw a wider set of violent attacks, huge damage, people killed. We saw, again, there was no effective prosecutions. And in fact, we saw President Sirisena pardoning Yanasara, who then was released from prison and joined up with other prominent monks to lead a nationwide campaign against Muslims and particularly against their political leadership. We saw social discrimination and harassment pick up, including not just from Sinhalese, but from Tamils and Christians. But most important of all, and here I think was a major shift that we need to note, and I think it's already been hinted at or indicated by the other presentations. For the first time, the state, in the guise of its security forces, police, and intelligence agencies, and senior politicians, for the first time begin to actively harass Muslims in the name of countering terrorism and countering extremism. So we saw a series of arrests on arbitrary grounds, thousands of Muslims arrested, often for nothing or for trumped up charges or based on misunderstandings. We saw the beginning of serious proposals for legislative reforms, many of them quite draconian, to tackle the supposed Muslim threat. And we saw Gotabaya Rajapaksa campaign for president on the basic platform of protecting people against the Muslim threat and against extremism, and with strong backing from the Buddhist clergy and from their temple networks. So now under the government of President Rajapaksa, who was elected in November of last year, we see anti-Muslim positions have become state policy. So this is absolutely unprecedented. So we've gone from sort of local level attacks to larger national campaigns of violence and hate speech, to now the point where the state itself has sanctioned these policies and is promoting them actively. So we saw for the first time ever a government with no Muslim ministers. We have active harassment and propaganda against Muslim politicians, both by government and by their backers in the private media and state media. We have a mandatory cremation policy for COVID-19 victims, despite the lack of scientific justification, despite global condemnation by UN experts, the criticism by the WHO and foreign governments. We see media harassment, regularly blaming Muslims for spreading the virus. We see government arrests of Muslim activists on questionable grounds and without following due process. We see what appears to be the politicization of investigations into the Easter bombings. and with the prospect of continued promotion of this threat through arrests and through trials, perhaps. And we see a new move to work sort of cooperation between the military and Buddhist monks to defend Buddhist heritage sites in the Eastern Province against alleged Muslim encroachment. And we see a series of potential legislative changes to be proposed in the new parliament once it's elected to address the threat of Muslim extremism. And clearly this is all part of an electoral strategy for the upcoming parliamentary elections, currently delayed, but coming sometime fairly soon probably. But it's also, I think, the question is where that will go from here, and how will it, can the anti-Muslim sentiment that the state is now itself officially sanctioning and promoting, can it be contained by the state? And how is there a real danger of a reactive violence eventually from some Muslims? And is that perhaps the point? Is that perhaps something that some in the government would like to have actually another example of Muslim violent extremism that they could then use to sort of further justify their policies? So just final point, just to sort of sum up, I think what's happening now is the rationalization and the state, through the state backing of the anti-Muslim campaign, in which the state takes over the leadership from renegade monks and mobs, renegade monks like Janissar and others, and controls it and deploys it for their political purposes. And how, I think maybe we can discuss in the question and answer period, perhaps, what are the possible responses? Because I think it puts all of us who are concerned, whether you're a Muslim or not, whether you're in Sri Lanka or not, whether you're just someone who wants Sri Lanka to be a peaceful and prosperous island, real questions about how to respond to this new stage of the anti-Muslim campaign in Sri Lanka. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. That's an excellent picture of the overview situation of human rights and racism in Sri Lanka. Now I invite Dr. Feroz to speak on the COVID-19 crisis and associated racism in Sri Lanka. Dr. Feroz.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Basil, for giving me the opportunity, and hello to the other panel members, Alan, Niaz, and Sister Anika. Thank you for this opportunity. I just would like to start with the current situation in Sri Lanka, which is the lockdown or the curfew situation with COVID-19, and also the burning issue which Muslims are facing with regards to cremation of bodies. Now, obviously, Alan beautifully established with the chronological order of events preceding and proceeding from the Easter attack, causing significant distress to the minority population, namely the Muslim population in Sri Lanka. And also the background to it has also been elicited with the reports we produced, which was quite detailed and also insightful. However, I think that the worrying concern at the moment is institutionalization and also endorsement of certain political or departmental powers, which causes distress to the system, where it makes it difficult to legally challenge. And for me, this would be the worry. I believe the rule of law is still to a larger extent there in Sri Lanka, which you can at least lodge the process to take it forward. And I am a great believer in law and the rule, the rule of law. And I do believe that there is still scope to harvest this element of public protection from in Sri Lanka, but the worrying concern at the moment, just talking with the background of COVID-19, is the endorsement by the State Department against the scientific evidence. For me, as a clinician and also coming from the scientific background, that is my most worrying concern, because if we go back to what happened with regards to the new gazette. Initially, obviously, as you all know, according to the WHO guidelines, it was advised that you could bury or cremate this body, okay? But overnight, this decision was changed. Obviously, there seems to be a political influence into this departmental health guidelines, and which was reversed overnight. And it was concluded that burial is not an option. Now, I'm going to dive straight into the scientific basis for this, because it's important to kind of bring some light into this from the scientific background. Is there is not a single research evidence to prove that a dead body with COVID-19 is any more infectious than a living body. Now, this is a very crucial scientific piece which anybody with a scientific sight would be able to see before you draw a conclusion as to how these bodies should be buried. The second point I'm not going to go into details of these scientific arguments, because we did that quite a few times through social media. But the second most important thing to notice is the contagiousness of this disease, COVID-19, the virus SARS-CoV-2. It actually, according to the UK guidelines, also which is adopted by Canada and the US and the rest of Europe, is that it falls under the category 3 of infections. So it's not a blood-borne disease, which is as contagious, and you might have to have special measures to bury them. So considering these two factors, the way how the disease spreads when the host is live and when the host is dead, is a deciding factor as to how you would take precautions in terms of avoiding further spread of this disease. And on top of that, the actual infectivity of this disease. So when you compare these two, it's pretty obvious for everybody that the bodies are safe. However, if you look at how this entire course was engineered, sewed into a structural system which stops a particular group of population, I'm talking about Muslims and the minorities, that how that fundamental right has been systematically taken away from them and sewed and sutured into a more of a departmental system which cannot be overthrown. And for me, this is extremely worrying, because from a democratic perspective, from a country, everything's system. You need a system for things to work, and it should have the consensus of the majority, not just the majority as a voting majority, as the majority of the experts who give certain advices towards one course or one decision making based on either scientific or medical or financial or a business model. And that should be the core aspect of decision making. And even considering a person who makes that decision has got a high barrier authority in the WHO itself, contradicting WHO's guidance, I fully understand it's a guidance, but the guidance comes because of scientific reasons. And that has not been taken into consideration, and further encourage the decision which was made, or to even enhance that decision. Further scientific evidence were, in my opinion, either fabricated or just carefully chosen the positive elements to support the argument compared to the actual truth behind the hydrodynamics of the soil and geological survey reports. So so for me, this is as Alan mentioned right at the end. So for me, it looks like it's a systematic embroidery into a departmental system, and also a country's legislative arms, so that it makes it very, very difficult for the person who is affected, or the minority who is affected, to be able to come out of it and challenge it. It's a really good move from the minority perspective. Sorry, I'm talking about minorities, just not as Muslims, because that's what I'm interested in, not just as Muslims. But from the minority perspective, and I think this is good that this time Muslims have come forward to challenge these legally from the judiciary system that they have put these FR cases, fundamental right cases, in the Supreme Court. And I think there are two things. Number one, the public awareness. I think not only just Muslims and the Sinhalese population, the Tamils, it's important that they know the facts behind the problem we are facing. I'm just particularly talking about COVID-19 as that was my topic. And so they need to know the science behind it. They need to know the facts behind it. So that's very, very important. Due to the rapid nature of encompassing these laws and gazettes into the legal system, everything actually has gone underground. People were very scared or very doubtful about questioning this. And also the need for them to cry out or ask help or go forward in challenging them. And by bringing these cases forward with the Supreme Court, and I think it would have dug up some awareness within the general public. And it's very important, not just the minorities, but also the majority population are aware of the basis why this case is being challenged. And it's a good opportunity for the Muslim community to be able to go out, not physically because of the shutdown, but go out in terms of vocalizing what is the basis behind their notion of challenging it. It's not about not being patriotic, because this is how it was actually widely portrayed in the social media, that if Muslims cannot accept the cremation, it means that they do not have the national interest in their mind. Their cultural practice, their religious practice is more important to them than the collective benefit of the country and the nation. And this is how it was portrayed. But this is grossly factually incorrect. The reason why the Muslims wanted to fight against it, this is not only their fundamental right of deciding how their loved ones' bodies should be dispensed of, it is also a crucial aspect of their religion and their belief. There are 4 compulsory things one should do to the dead bodies of a Muslim, and this burying them is one part of it. And I'm sure if there is significant, unshakable scientific reasons why you should not be burying these, which would be established more than by one means, and I am sure the Muslim community will accept it. There is no questions about it. But because of there is overwhelming evidence to prove the contrary, it is why the Muslims are fighting for the rights. So they are fighting for 2 rights here. Number one, for their fundamental rights of deciding what should happen to their body or their loved ones. And number 2, their religious right. As everybody knows, Muslims practice Islam as a way of life. Okay, so this is very important. People, non-Muslims, especially the majority population in Sri Lanka, understand Islam, and the practice of Islam is embedded into the lives of Muslims. They can see it visibly. You know, in a day they pray 5 times a day. You know, every part of things what they do is embedded. So long as it does not impinge in the rights of the others, so long as it does not put the national security or the well-being of the second person, that every other community should respect it. The same goes to the rights and practices of other religions respected by Muslims. So for me, this is to bring that out of the ground and give that information out to the public is very important in winning the minds and the hearts of the majority in Sri Lanka. And as you mentioned, Alan, that yes, these are small parties who've been supported by certain forces, try to spread hatred amongst the country and amongst the layperson, and that first doesn't shift the layperson into a person who actually go and attack Muslim. It actually neutralizes their view. Initially, you would have a positive view because of what you see from your daily practice. And these kind of negative ideas and this pseudo evidences which promotes Muslims as terrorists, that is going to neutralize the positive idea a layperson has. And once you're in a neutral view, it's very easy for you to shift from the positive to the negatives. And that had been happening in a systematic way. And what doesn't help the situation is when there is endorsement from the states. And I think what needs to happen is, from a judiciary perspective, the judicial team has to be neutral, look at the evidences in front of it and rule. In my opinion, I have no doubt the scientific evidences will support the case against the cremation. And once that's been won, it is important the Muslim population do not stop there, just go forward in terms of addressing the general public with regards to getting the support from the general public about the need of coexistence, not just with Muslims and also with non-Muslims, especially the Tamil population, who has been going through such a hardship for almost 30 years. And it's very, very important as minority communities, you work together to win your rights, to fight this war against the perpetrators. Thank you.
Sorry, Doctor, we are running out of time. Thank you very much, Doctor. I understand that this topic couldn't be covered in a short slot, but it was a good brief anyway. Thank you very much again. Now, Brother Nisa, I think we can wind up. So we have a lot of questions. So we'll try my best to answer it through the email. Alan and Brother Nias answered a few questions through the Q&A box. I think I have a special question to Alan. From a few members asked the same question. So Alan, do you think Sri Lanka is going towards a military government? I think we can stop with this question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's too simple a way to put it, but I think it's clear that the military is being cultivated by President Rajapaksa through various means. They're being put in many senior military officials, mostly retired, but including some serving generals and high-ranking officers are now in positions running civil administrative positions, agents, ministries, departments of ministries, etc. That's a new phenomenon. Like something like more than 20 have been appointed to senior positions just in the last 6 months under Gotabaya. The military is definitely being cultivated, given a very frontal role in the COVID-19 response efforts. I doubt that, I don't think Sri Lanka is in imminent danger of becoming a military government, but I think that the military will become sort of increasingly a kind of a co-governing body, working closely with Gotabaya and his family and his supporters, but also with the monks. I think the monks are obviously, have always been influential in post-independent Sri Lanka, but I think they're being given a higher role. So this kind of triumvirate of sort of singular Buddhist politicians, nationalist politicians, the military and the monks, that kind of triangle, mutually supporting and legitimating triangle, I think is definitely on the ascendance and could potentially transform Sri Lankan politics in really important and I think quite worrying ways. Could I respond, Bazir, just quickly to some of the other questions about the role of the international community? Because of course I work for a group called the International Crisis Group, and one of our kind of main roles is to engage, to try to help sort of translate and understand events, in this case in Sri Lanka, for the larger international community, quote unquote, and then give suggestions for them and how to respond. I just want to make 2 points. One, I do think the Sri Lankan government does still care about the international community. I know that Gotabaya has made a number of moves just in the last 6 months in power. First, withdrawing Sri Lanka from the UN Human Rights Council process. And secondly, his speech just last week, in which he said, any international agency that harasses us and harasses our brave soldiers, war heroes, we will not hesitate to leave. But I think he will hesitate to leave the IMF, and he will hesitate to leave the World Bank, and he will hesitate to leave the ADB. So when it comes to money, which the Sri Lankan government desperately needs, like all governments do, of course, after COVID and the disaster that this will be for all economies. But even before that, they were basically bankrupt and have huge amounts of money to repay over the coming years for their international debts. So there's a lot of leverage that international financial institutions and the governments that fund them which means Western governments, which means Japan, which means India, which means Australia, a whole range of governments who are quite concerned about with Sri Lanka and actively engaged with Sri Lanka. They have a lot of leverage if they're willing to use it. Second of all, I think the other key thing is the international community in its various guises, whether it means bilaterally between one country and Sri Lankan government, or whether it means through international agencies like the UN or like these financial institutions. They have to be very careful that their policies don't end up contributing to or legitimating inadvertently the Sri Lankan government's increased sort of anti-Muslim policies. So even if they can't directly prevent things, they can be smarter about how they engage with Sri Lanka and don't end up, for instance, supporting counterterrorism and countering violent extremism programs, which end up demonizing and legitimating anti-Muslim activities by the government. So there's ways in which the international community, even if it can't fundamentally shift Sri Lankan government policies, can at least prevent them from encouraging or actively supporting bad policies.
Sorry, Basil, just 30 seconds, if you don't mind. I fully agree with Alan. I think he made a very, very salient point there. Everything's actually costed on the basis of acting terrorism. And I think this is the biggest problem at the moment the Muslim community faces, because of you cannot divide what's not related to terrorism and what is related to terrorism. As you know, after the 14th of May, there had been 197 arrests again. So which means that there's a lot of witch hunting going on with no proper basis in the background. I think the best way to engage the government and the policymakers is through the international pressures, through the financial medium, rather than going through the just UN itself. I think it's a very good point, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Feroz. Thank you, Dr. Alan. I recorded all the questions, so we will definitely answer all the questions via email in future. Thank you so much again to all our panelists and participants from many international organizations I can see here. So thankful to Alan Keenan for joining us today. Hope that many more like-minded and supporters will join us. I leave you all with that, and thank you all for your participation. And thanks to everyone who raised questions. I'm sorry I couldn't include everything during lack of time, but I appreciate your participation. Thank you very much.